Final Fantasy as a franchise has kind of been a wild card in many ways, as they've experimented so many times to the point where we can't really distinguish the gameplay identity of the series anymore. As with any team that takes up the mantle of Final Fantasy, they really have no barriers as to what they can create for a new game, and that kind of creates a problem for the series as a whole. This is a series of games that loves to experiment, especially now. And while it's great that we can have a franchise like Final Fantasy that can experiment and create something new every time, it's almost ironic that creating something new every time has almost been detrimental to the growth of the series. The action versus turn-based argument when it comes to Final Fantasy I think is kind of trivial because these individual choices aren't really the problem. We've seen franchises like Yakuza go from a beat-em-up to a turn-based type of style, and those games did extremely well before and they do extremely well now. You know, I've never really seen it as a question of whether it should be one or the other, but more so sticking to a more consistent style of gameplay where people can look at this new game and the gameplay that is represented and be like, yeah, this is Final Fantasy. For too long, the series has seen so many drastic changes to direction in its gameplay that it really does more alienating to players than it does bring people in. And that isn't to say that the most recent titles in Final Fantasy have been bad in its gameplay direction in any way. I think the gameplay direction in both titles are very well done, but it's the simple fact that there is almost no consistency when it comes to both of these games. Besides maybe art direction, you can probably show both gameplay clips of both Final Fantasy 16 and Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth to a random person who knows nothing about the series and pretty much ask them if these two games are from the same series. I'd like to make a bet that they probably say they are not, and that is where the problem lies. Final Fantasy needs more consistency in gameplay. The way I see it, that is just the #1 priority. You know, the problem when it comes to modern Final Fantasy and the classic games is the fact that the modern games now almost seem like they're scared to take from elements that worked and implement them into newer games. And as a result of that unwillingness to take from elements that came before, things that worked, and instead creating things that are just completely new and starting from scratch, that not only alienates players that came before, new players that will also come into the franchise and try to gauge what these games are as well, it also just makes these games cost so much more and development time increases as a result. You know, instead of building off a foundation that came before and taking assets that were already created from past games, it almost seems like each Final Fantasy team now is trying to make things a lot more unnecessarily harder than it has to be. You know, there's always a balance to be had when it comes to creating something new while also looking back at what worked and building off of that foundation as well. Whether it's action combat or turn-based, Final Fantasy has a myriad of different games to look at and build off of, whether it is action or turn-based. Whether it's the hybrid style from Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth, the pure action combat that is Final Fantasy 16, or just going completely turn-based. There are so many games now that they can look at and build off of while creating things that are new. And it seems like now each new Final Fantasy title is kind of scared to look back at what worked and build off of those systems. And it really does not have to be that way. They need to establish that one form of gameplay is going to be the series standard for the next couple of entries. I think this alone will do so much for the health of the series going forward. I mean, for example, you look at Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth and you could automatically see like with the benefits of actually building off of what came before, building off of already great battle mechanics and a core gameplay system in general, and building off of that again for a future entry. And I honestly have no doubt in my mind that Final Fantasy 7 Remake Part 3 will be even more incredible in terms of just core gameplay and building off of an already incredible battle system. And this isn't me saying that future Final Fantasy games have to necessarily copy the homework of a gameplay system that came before. I mean, they could still create new battle systems for future Final Fantasy games, and I honestly think they will, but at the same time, I do think that they need to take elements that came from past Final Fantasy games in terms of gameplay and the systems that revolve around it, and mesh that with a new battle system if that's what they were going to do. But this idea of creating this entirely new battle system with almost no innovation to what came before, and just totally ignoring what the series has built thus far, I think is just a recipe to pretty much alienate your fan base. And that's what Final Fantasy has kind of been doing, right? I actually want to point out that, surprisingly, a lot of the teams that work on these Final Fantasy games don't actually communicate with each other. So teams like Creative Studio 1 and Creative Studio 3 that have been creating these Final Fantasy games recently, they don't actually communicate with each other in their creative processes. For the most part, it's all pretty self-contained to their own projects, and they don't really have a back and forth in terms of what's going on in development on their side in comparison to another team. And I mean, this honestly explains a lot when it comes to, you know, consistency between teams and just the games in general, right? The fact that they're not communicating with each other just really explains why games take so much longer than they have to, why every game just seems so different from the last. It all goes back to the teams who are making these Final Fantasy games. And the fact that every single team, even though they're working on the same franchises, feel like they're working on completely different games entirely. Games that aren't really in the same series. I mean, when it comes to, you know, just the modern Final Fantasies specifically, you can clearly tell that that sentiment rings true. I mean, there is no consistency here, and that's honestly hurting the franchise, or at least the reception of these games, more than anything else. You know, it's always great to have new things, but at the same time, you want to have that balance, and that is something that Final Fantasy has struggled with for years, and I mean, probably, you know, decades, right? So, you know, the fact that these teams are more separate in workflow than they are to share ideas and create these Final Fantasy games in a more shared vision for the next couple of entries within the franchise, I think it really does explain a lot of why modern Final Fantasy is just always different every time. Just like there's no coherency within the games themselves when it comes to gameplay, it also just seems like there's no real shared creativity with development teams that are working on these Final Fantasy games. And that is not good news to come across, because it's almost like they're shooting themselves in the foot. I mean, when you look at the older games of Final Fantasy, you can clearly tell there was a shared vision, right? There were a set couple of teams to work on these Final Fantasy games back then. When it comes to gameplay and the systems that revolved around it, I mean, even though a lot of these things were new every single game, it still felt coherent, where you could look at that game and be like, yeah, this is Final Fantasy, even though there was a lot of new things that were introduced. In Final Fantasy VII, you had materia system. In Final Fantasy VIII, you had the junction system. Final Fantasy IX had the kinda sorta job system where you would learn abilities from items. And then Final Fantasy X would have the very famous sphere grid system. But the core gameplay itself never really changed. It was all ATB, and every team that worked on these Final Fantasies seemed to always share a vision. That is something Final Fantasy has been missing for years. So I mean, the main thing for me is, you know, Final Fantasy just needs to find that balance in creativity when it comes to just creating a gameplay style that works, finding that gameplay style, and just, you know, establishing that as what Final Fantasy will be and how it will play in the years to come. You know, for me, it's not really a question of whether it's going to be action or turn-based, you know, that's really not my concern, right? Final Fantasy's problem for so long has been starting from scratch with every single one of their projects, and as a result, development for their games have become longer. Development costs for these games have gone up significantly because of this mindset to create something new every single time. And it really does not have to be that way. And that's just my 2 cents on it. You know, I love Final Fantasy, I love the modern games, and I love the classic games. I love Final Fantasy 16 and Rebirth, but I do think as a longtime fan of these games that consistency is absolutely key. And I think for the good of the series to finally have an established gameplay system where the teams aren't afraid to share ideas, share assets and engines between each game, you know, that can really go a long way for the franchise as a whole, and I think the health of the series would only improve from here. But I mean, tell me how you guys feel down below, because I know some people actually do like the fact that Final Fantasy can create something new entirely every single entry. The problems that come with that, I think, are extremely glaring to see. You know, those are my thoughts on where the franchise is currently at right now, and I honestly think that if they can create that same consistency that the older Final Fantasy games had, then like I said, I don't really think it would matter if it was turn-based or action at the end of the day. It's just the simple fact that every game just feels so different than the last. And I've said it so many times in this video, and I'll say it again, consistency is key.